Hey everyone, it took me a moment to get my video on. I want to share today a little bit, actually quite a bit, on Romans chapter 1. Welcome, welcome, welcome to Wednesday in the Word, Wednesday Live, hanging out here with me on Cynthia Martin Online. This is my ministry page, and we also have a group, a public group called Cynthia Martin Online, in which I do some in-depth teaching. If you'd like to join that, be sure to go over there and do that. So welcome. It's Wednesday, hopefully very close to 1 o'clock. I want to share again today on the book of Romans. And so we're going to go ahead and get started. Okay, Romans chapter 1. If you're looking, last week we went through a little bit through the introduction, and I'm going to do a little bit of that today. Not much, just because I think it's important that we realize what the book of Romans is all about. So the book of Romans was written by the Apostle Paul, who his Jewish name was Saul. And we know the New Testament, each of the books were written by someone, usually to a specific audience, sometimes a person, but most generally to an audience. And these were letters that were written on specific occasions to meet a specific need. And so it's very important when we begin to read something that we recognize who it was written to and why, and what was the need for which it was written. Let me see if I can get rid of the glare on my glasses here a little bit. There, I guess that's better. If we're to fully appreciate these letters, we need to understand those circumstances. So all of the letters of the New Testament were written in that way. I want to use an example that I found that I think was really great. And in this story, a gentleman was talking about his mother passing on. I actually have a friend who, when their mother passed, they found all of her journals. Their mother was a prolific writer and kept many journals, and she had kept her journals for her whole life. So this is much like that story. And so when their mother died, they found all of these letters and journals. And in the specific story that I want to share about today, they were letters. And so, as over the years, when they collected all these letters and they began to read through them, sometimes the letters were from people that they didn't even know. And so they were able to go to the envelope and look at postage, the little stamp that puts the date on it when it came through. And sometimes some of the letters were dated. So they were able to construct a little bit of her life history because of these letters. There were letters of congratulations on births of children, and condolences when the woman's mother had died. And so also a sister and had died. And so some condolence type letters. We found they found, I'm reading this here, just some notes that I have. They found some letters that were written by brothers that were in the army, when then they were sending letters home to her from overseas. And even from the gentleman that was reading the letter, he found a letter that he had written to his mother when he was in college. And so reading her mail was really a fascinating experience, because at times it was perplexing because they didn't know who some of the people who they were from, their brothers or people in the family they would know, but they found some letters that people that circumstances and situations that they really were clueless about, because she had kept them for her whole life. And so as they studied these letters and read through them and noted the postmarks on the envelopes, they were able to construct the circumstances under which they were written. And they took on new meaning for them as they began to understand why they were written. So that so relates to the New Testament. When we can take a look at, understand, and study out the reason why letters are written, it gives us a new meaning. And to be able to understand the occasion for which they were created. So not all letters are specific to us in a situation, which we find a lot in Paul's writings. A lot people, just in general, sometimes we'll take a verse out of a book that was written to a specific place because of a specific problem, and they will take out that verse and make it a doctrine for everything, everywhere, all the time. And that's why it's so important that we recognize the context of what we're reading. So obviously, for us to find the full meaning of the letter of Romans, which is Paul's longest letter, we need to understand the circumstances for which he wrote it. And we need to understand his message in the original setting. And we need to use that basis when we try to determine what it means. And so let's go ahead and let's dig in a little bit here. I want to share a bit here about, so Paul wrote we see later in the book, in Romans chapter 15, we see that he states that he wrote the book for a couple of reasons: to gather some prayer support, right? And if you're on my email community, you're going to be getting an email about being on some prayer support for me as well. And so he wrote to the Romans asking for prayer support. And also, he wanted to let them know that he was praying for them. And we know that Paul wrote the letter to solicit the Romans' support for prayer and for financial resources for his missions, right? And so this is the longest letter that Paul wrote that we have, and it was written to a congregation that he'd never seen. He didn't know these people. Every other letter, he had either began the church itself or he had visited there previously. So this was kind of a letter of introduction, and yet he was introducing himself, but because he was the apostle to the Gentiles, he felt that it was in his sphere of in the sphere, right? Sphere of influence. So nobody knows really for sure how the church, the body of believers, not a building, the body of believers started. Nobody knows for sure. Although Christian tradition tells us that Paul himself and Peter were killed in Rome. So we know that he wrote to be, specifically says something about being mutually edified, and it doesn't actually use those words because it talks about he's writing to them to impart a gift, but also to receive a gift. And we'll see about that when we dig into it as well. We also see that Romans is really celebrated as one of the most significant theological document that's ever written. A lot of people believe that to be true. It has a lot of information in it. Now, it makes you wonder when you say something like that, how can that be when we have the Gospels, right? And I think that's why it's so important that we take a look at this, because the fact that many times we make the book of Romans more important than the Gospels because of the doctrine. And just so you know, I do appreciate the teachings of Paul, but he's not more important than Jesus. Okay. So let's make sure that we understand that. If you're following me and my teaching, I just want to let you know, Paul is, yes, he's a great father in our faith, but he's not more important than Jesus. And so we follow what Jesus says, and we get some further explanation through the Apostle Paul. And so Paul in Romans taught certain themes that were central to his own Christian faith. Now, he didn't tell everything because he didn't do an exhaustive of all his beliefs, or the letter would have been way too long, right? But he did, because we know that because he didn't speak about the Lord's Supper. He didn't talk about feasts and all that kind of stuff, but he did write the most fully developed presentation that we have of his understanding of the Christian faith in the book of Romans. The document, this letter, is more than any other shaped the theological development and stimulated creative imaginations. This part I'm reading, you can tell because I don't talk that way. This document, more than any other, shaped the theological document and the stimulated and created imaginations of some of the greatest figures the church has known. Augustine, now I know who he is. Of course, Martin Luther, I know who he is. John Wesley, know who he is, and a gentleman named Karl Barth. But believe me, I don't know who he is, but I will be looking him up. So all three of them were heavily influenced by the book of Romans. Of course, we know Martin Luther, his 95 Thesis was all about justification by faith. And so let's look at Romans chapter 1. So the beginning of this this book, this letter, um, Paul begins with telling who he is, because the pattern of a letter for us today, we would write, maybe have our return address at the top and write dear so and so and have a date, and then we would go through it, and then we would write dear, who it was to, dear whoever, and then at the bottom we would sign our name. Well, in the particular custom of the day, because letters were written on scrolls, so they were rolled up. And so, if you think about, this is a pretty long letter, and it would be significant to have a book uh, that would be rolled up. It would be a scroll, right? And it could be in excess of 30 feet. And so you wouldn't want to unroll a scroll. I've got to get here something out here. Something's falling over on my desk, so disregard this. So if you think about a scroll and this long of a work that it is, right? It's rolled up. And so in order to see if they wrote in the tradition of our day, they would have to unroll that thing, let's say 30 feet, to determine who wrote the dumb thing, right? Lord, forgive me. The book of Romans is not dumb. But so in this particular sense, and even in the sense of the day, Paul himself begins with who it is from, rather than who it's to, like we do. He started out with who it is from, and we see he takes 7 verses to really introduce the topic of who he is and why he's writing. Now, generally, he'll just take 1, maybe 2 verses when Paul writes, but in this specific book, he takes quite a few verses. And we think the reason why that is because he's writing to an audience that he didn't know, and they didn't know him. And so he begins his letter with an introduction of who he is, explaining the reason and the purpose for which he writes. So Paul is not, I want to just say, it's been suggested that Saul became Paul because of his conversion. Well, if we look into Saul's life, nobody knows for sure, okay? But here are some things that we can consider. His parents were Jewish, but they were also Roman citizens. It was not unusual in those types of circumstance for a parent to give their child 2 names. Saul, which would have been a great Jewish name, and Paul, which would have been a great Greek or Roman name. And so as he was known in the Jewish world, he was Saul. And then we know that he was an apostle that was called to be the apostle to the Gentiles. He would have been known by his Greek or his Roman name. That's what I personally believe, because we see in the book of Acts, this is before Romans, that after he's converted, he's still being referred to as Saul. And if he had a name change then, they would have began to call him Paul back then. But the Jews referred to him as Saul, and then in the book of Acts later, we see that his name is changed. He's still being called Saul in the book of Acts through 13, Acts chapter 13. So he was probably given both names at first. There's another gentleman that we see in scripture, John Mark. His Jewish name is John, his Roman name is Mark. So that is common. So he was called depending in what situation that he's in. So Paul says in the verse 1 that he is a servant, an apostle, and he's set apart. So let's talk about the word servant for just a moment. A servant could be interpreted almost as a slave, low value, that they really are there at the behest of their master. And so, using this terminology, he translates to the people of Rome that he is there to serve, and that his call is to serve, and it also underlines his commitment. Then his second indicator, which he speaks of himself often, is the word apostle, which just means one sent out. And it's borrowed from the idea of diplomacy. This word originally was indicated one who is sent by a government or a commissioned official a representative of another. It was used, for example, for a king to send someone, an envoy, messengers would send an apostle, a sent one, to carry the message of a king to a court. And that person, that apostle, that sent one, really had no authority in of himself, but he carried with him the authority of the king or the emissary, whoever sent him out. He carried that person's authority to accomplish that which he was sent for. And so this is a title that Paul often uses of himself, a sent one, an apostle. And we know that this is a word that he really identified with. He also understood, and he wanted to portray, when he was introducing himself to the Romans, that he was sent by God. He was a sent one. He carried the message and the authority from God to them to give, and he carried that authority. I guess I repeated that, didn't I? And then also the last part is he said he's set apart, which we know that that's kind of like a separated. It actually comes from the word we use is consecrated. And it's been suggested that the term Pharisee, of which Saul was before he was converted, comes from the same root word. But there's a little bit of difference here, because the Pharisee, including Saul of Tarsus, who is Paul, right? He was a Pharisee. But because a Pharisee is really interested in the strict observance of law and rule, and they're rigid in what they follow, and they separate themselves from other people, almost in a smugness or in a superiority in their self-separation, because they are attributing themselves maybe to a higher order. But Paul's separation, when he's talking about here, his set apartness is a little bit different, because we know the word, like I've already mentioned, the word consecrated. It's being set apart is a bit different. It's not set apart from others. It's set apart for something. It's not away from people, but it's pulled out of maybe what we're doing and who we are and what we're being to something else. And so he was separated for a purpose, to proclaim the gospel and to bring the good news and of what God had accomplished through Jesus. And so by mentioning the word gospel, Paul uses a word that establishes a rapport with his readers, because they were Christians, people of the way, and they had been transformed by this good news. And so, it's kind of like when you go somewhere, and maybe when I go somewhere and I see someone who went to the Bible school that I went to, we have a same spirit because we were under the same teaching. Or if I go and see someone from my high school, or I see someone that I was in a Lamaze class with when I had my first daughter, those kinds of things. We're in a group together, right? We have identification together. So in verse 2, or in Romans chapter 1, verse 2, Paul defines the content of the gospel in the next two verses. In verses 3 and 4, he talks about that Jesus is mentioned in these two verses. First, Paul says that Jesus was made of the seed of David according to the flesh. So he's establishing that Jesus is the fulfillment of a prophecy in the Old Testament. And then it goes on to verse 3, the statement further expresses Paul what he had already written in verse 2, that Jesus had come in the fulfillment of the Old Testament, right? And so we know that in verse 5, after making it clear who Jesus is, Paul returns to his self-introduction. In verse 5, he says that it is the exalted Son of God who has called him to be an apostle. Specifically, his commission is to bring about obedience to the faith, the positive response of faith to the gospel among all nations. Now, the Greek word translated nations there can actually be translated as Gentiles. Thank the Lord, right? I'm one of those Gentiles. So among this large group of Paul's readers, most of the readers that he's sending this letter to are going to be those Gentiles. So in verse 6, and then Paul strengthens the bond between them himself by saying that they too have been called by God, just as he's been called to be an apostle. Okay, did you hear that right now? He said that they had been called by God, just like he had been called by God. And the word called in verse 6 is a transition to the next part of the letter, and where he names those who are receiving it. And those are the ones in Rome who are the beloved of God, called the saints. Now, our idea of saints may be different than what the Bible says a saint is. And so let's talk about that for just a moment. Sometimes it's very misunderstood in the modern day world because we think, well, I'm not a saint. I can't walk on water. I don't know if you've ever heard that. Or we tend to think people that are really pious, or maybe a monk of long ago, or people that are committed to a religious order of some sort, right? We usually think of it as a saint as someone who lived long ago and is now dead, right? There's the saints, and we know that comes from Catholicism, and some of it even in our own minds. But it's not that we imply that we pay. It's not really that we're paying someone a compliment when we say, "Oh, she's a living saint." Sometimes that can be a little bit almost snarky, right? But the word saint in the New Testament means one who is made holy. And for Paul, every Christian is a saint. And so if we could really grab hold of just that sentence, that every Christian is a saint. I was very upset many years ago when there was a gentleman at the church where we were serving that was a door greeter, right? And he'd open the door and say, "Welcome, sinners." And I said to him when he said that, to me, I was like, "No, I'm not a sinner. I'm a saint." And I just had a really bad reaction to it. Probably not the best way to handle the situation, but I didn't think that was the best greeting to be greeting. And I realized he was trying to identify. But if we are in relationship with the Lord, we are a saint. And if we focus on what we are rather than what we think we aren't, we're going to become what we think, right? And so important that we recognize that we are made holy. If we have a relationship with Jesus Christ, our position is that we are holy. We are a saint. So, Paul's greeting in chapter 1, verse 7 is grace and peace. And I want to talk about that for just a moment. It combines two forms of greeting. Grace is really attributed to more of a Greek thought. And the first century, the Greeks and the Jews of the first century. So Greek would translate the word grace as a gift from God, right? And we kind of get that idea when we think graceful. Oh, it's just so beautiful, right? A gift from God. But it also took an additional meaning that it was someone was beautiful to behold, and the gods had bestowed this quality upon them. And Paul sees that word as an apt summary of the gospel because the favor of God is freely given to the unworthy people, right? His grace is given to us and made beautiful. So here he used it not only as a greeting, but also as a prayer for his readers. And then the second one is peace and grace, and peace and grace is grace and shalom, peace, right? Grace and peace, which is the word shalom, is really a Jewish word, and it means peace, yes, but not just the absence of warfare. It implies a relationship with God, or a tranquil, stable relationship with the Father. And so with Godhead, really, I don't want to limit it to just a Father God. And so it's the result of a reconciliation with God if we have shalom. It's a wholeness and a peace in that wholeness. So he combines the two, and he always writes grace first and then peace, which is shalom, right? Because without the grace of God causing us to be saints, right? Holy, made holy, then we can never have the shalom. So we cannot know real peace until we have the grace that God bestows upon us. And then Paul's letter goes in from chapter 8, or excuse me, chapter 1, verses 8 through 15, he goes through a prayer of thanksgiving for his readers, right? And he talks about in chapter, or I keep saying chapter, in verse 9, I give thanks without ceasing, right? And I always mention you in my prayers. And we know he doesn't know them, but he is an apostle to the Gentiles and he knows of them. And so he has a prayerful concern for them and he's thanking God for them. And he shares that in his letter to them. So a visit by Paul to by Paul to the Romans could be mutually beneficial, he says, as I had mentioned already, because he wants to give them a gift and also he'll be strengthened. And that happens when we are serving the Lord using our gifts. And that's found in verse 11 and 12. And then it goes on to say that he's been prevented from coming to Rome in verse 13. And then he states that he wants to come and visit them so that he can get some fruit among them, even as he has in other Gentiles. So by fruit, we can cultivate fruit by, yes, salvation, but also by nurturing the saints of God, right? And by building relationship and being able to speak into them and to encourage them to go deeper, which is more my call. Now, not that I'm not called to share the gospel, because I am, everyone is, but my basic call to the body is to encourage and to promote growth. So Paul defines for his readers the extent of his work and his mission among Gentiles. He says that he's a debtor, Debtor, under obligation to both Greeks and Greek speaking people, right? And the barbarians, that would be those who did not speak Greek during that time. You were a barbarian if you didn't speak Greek. To the wise and to the educated and to the unwise, the uneducated. So he's not being particular about ministering to a certain socioeconomic group. He made it clear that his work in ministry was for all Gentiles, not just specific Gentiles, where there are some who were called to minister to the Jews. And we know when Jesus was walking the earth, when he sent his apostles, his disciples at the time out to carry his words, kind of like, practice run, he sent them to the Jews only at the time. And so it's not uncommon for for us to be called to a specific people group or a specific type of ministry. And so we see that in verse 15. And then along about verse 16, he says he's talking about the good news of Jesus Christ. So it may be seen, might be seen as something foolish to Gentiles or to Greeks and to Jews. I mean, it may be seen weak as Jews, but he's not ashamed of it, is what he's saying. I don't, it doesn't, some people may say that it's foolishness. And some people may say it's weak, right? I've heard people say, oh, you just need a crutch. Well, yeah, I do. And so he's not ashamed of it. And he is one of the things I do appreciate about Paul is he's a straight shooter, right? And that goes right in with the way I teach. I'm going to just tell it to you straight. And so he's not ashamed of the gospel because it has the power of God, right? To bring us to salvation. So he also goes on and he talks a little bit about this whole section is kind of like the introduction of the statement of the theme, which of course we know is justification by faith. So he goes on to talk about this faith. It's not something a person does or something that a person can earn. Salvation is a free gift, but it implies nothing that we can do on our part to get it. So from the start to finish, salvation is an accomplishment of God. Hear that. Salvation is an accomplishment of God. Our job for us is by faith to take it. We receive what God offers. He's handing it out to us. He's already done the work. He can still provide for whatever we need, and he's got it lifted out to us and he's saying, here it is. I've done all the work. Take it. So rather than an act, it's an attitude of openness or surrender to God. And so he goes on to explain that the gospel of Christ, the righteousness of God is revealed in the gospel. And so the word points to his this righteousness really points towards his activity. He is God is righteous, but his activity is righteousness. His activity is to cause us to be righteous. He calls us right. Um, one of the illustrations that I saw was a book. I've always got a book laying around, so let me grab one here. I have this book, right? And it's laying flat. Now I can look at this book and I can call it righteous, right? Or I can say that it's upright and it's right, but something's got to come along and set it up in order for it to be upright, right? And so God comes along and he takes us where we are and he brings us into righteousness in position and in the actual who we are. I love what Graham Cook says, and he teaches the idea, and it's really not the ideal, it's the truth, but he expounds on the truth of our positional, what we call our positional status or what we're called. So how does heaven see us? You know, in heaven I'm righteous. In heaven I'm whole. In heaven I have the authority of God. In heaven I'm this, right? And that is really our true identity. And we need to begin to live out of that. And so much like this illustration that I used, you know, we see ourselves as this, but God sees us as that. And he has done all of the work. We just need to join him and accept the work that he's given us. So we could think of, we can kind of almost use the terminology for faith as belief. And I many times will interchange that idea and that word. And from faith to belief, it's easier for me to understand if I use the word belief, because we use in the English language, like I mentioned at the very beginning, we interchange words and we use words very flippantly that are very serious words. Like we say, oh, I love that. Oh, I love that. Oh, I love that. And it really cheapens the word love. And so faith, we say, what faith are you? And it's really, we're talking about belief. So God offers to us this righteousness, right? This righteousness, he's got this gift to us, but he doesn't coerce us to take it. We have the opportunity to be made right, and we must accept God's offer to us. But then Paul refers to a statement. He takes a something that the prophet Habakkuk said in chapter 2, verse 4, in Habakkuk 2:4, which he quotes, Paul quotes with a new emphasis. And he says the familiar translation, the just shall live by faith. But it might better and more properly read, the one who has been justified, made right, by faith shall live, right? And so we miss that part, I believe. I mean, maybe you don't, but I have. Maybe we don't encompass the by faith I shall live as much as we say, you know, there's other scripture that I'm thinking of off the top of my head that it says that everything that's not of faith is of sin. Ouch, we're going to be digging into that, right? So, um, the one who's been justified, I'm going to read this sentence again, made right by faith shall live, right? The one who has been justified, made right by faith shall live. So Paul is not just describing a quality of the characteristics of life or of God himself. Maybe the lifestyle of a person who's made righteous by God. Rather, he's emphasizing the means by which a person is made righteous by faith. We have to believe it, right? We have to believe it. So, you know, sometimes, or when I do something wrong, I don't believe it, but we always have to believe it. With these words, Paul has given us the theme that the rest of this book, the rest of this letter is written, justification by faith. And so it characterizes Paul's theology better than any other descriptive phrase. Paul simply states, we are made right by God because of our response to God's offer to grace. And that, my dear friend, is the summary of Romans chapter 1. I hope you're getting it. By getting it, I hope it's making sense to you, I guess. I hope that this is helpful to you, and I hope you're enjoying the deep dive. Next week, we'll be looking into Romans chapter 2. Also, I wanted to share with you, if you're in my email community, I'm sending out quite a few things. I've started some new things. On Saturday, I'm going to be sending out some things on prayer. And Friday, I'm going to be doing some Freedom Friday things in our Cynthia Martin online group. So you want to be sure to look for that. Get in my email community because all announcements come out through that first, followed up by online. And I have so many things going on. You want to make sure that you know what's happening, when, and where. And the last thing that I want to share with you today that I want to remind you of, and you're probably going to say, Cynthia, you told us, but I'm telling you again. I am launching a new membership program called She Blooms. And it really comes out of the idea, bloom where you're planted. And I'm such a fanatic about flowers. I just love flowers. On a side note, when I was getting my life straightened out, I was trying to decide if I was going to buy a flower shop because of my love for flowers or if I was going to go to ministry school. Well, you can tell which one won. I think it was God's call that did, but there's still that deep love of flowers. So we're using that as our logo, and it's called She Blooms, and it's all about us coming into the fullness of who we are, being planted in the Lord and grown up, and being the fragrant, beautiful women of God that we are. So She Blooms is a membership program. Yes, there's a cost and there's a reason for that. But I'm also offering once a month because I do believe that I need to serve my audience. The audience of people that want to learn and want to grow, right? And so the third Tuesday night of every month, I'll be offering a She Blooms group meeting in which you're welcome to join in as a guest, which there'll be some teaching, some prayer. There'll be some ministry by those who are on my ministry team. They're being trained up to use their gifts. And so you can get some, possibly come in and get some ministry, personal ministry, maybe on the topic that we're talking about or something else, or get a prophetic word. And that's what we're doing. So if you'd like to join that, to be trained up, to get established and solidified in your relationship with Jesus, and also to learn how to use your gift, find out who you are. And the 21st, May 21st, I'll make sure I got my calendar right. I think it's May the 21st. Yep. May 21st is our first official in which we'll be launching it. I'm going to be casting vision for what She Blooms membership is about. But you're welcome to join us the third Tuesday night of every month. And I'd love to have you come not this Tuesday. Yeah, the next Tuesday. 21st, May 21st, if you're catching this on the live, and you can join me and see if it's something that the Lord would have you do. So again, check that out. You can check on social media. There's going to be lots of ways that you can get registered because you will need to get registered for the Zoom call in order to join that. So I just bless you today to walk in faith, to take on your identity of a righteous one, take on your identity as one that is sent out, even as Paul told us here in Romans chapter 1, not only be sent out and called out and separated, but to be righteous and to be the saint of God that he's created you to be, right? There's so many good words and so many good identity statements just in chapter 1. I can't wait to dig in and go through the rest of this important book. God bless you and have a fabulous day. We'll see you next time. We'll see you on Saturday in the group or next week right here on the channel. Have a great day. Bless you.